Hi everyone, I'm Mark. I'm one of the marine specialists at Natural England. Here I am between the mountains of Cumbria in the north and the low grassy plains of Lancashire in the south, in this enormous bay created by glaciers and meltwater thousands of years ago. Now this is Morecambe Bay, and I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of the reasons why Morecambe Bay is such a great place for nature. So one of the most characteristic features of the bay are its tides. So the shape of the Irish Sea and the orientation of the bay means that during high tide a huge amount of water races into Morecambe Bay at a spine-tingling speed, filling it up so it's brimming. Then as the tide drops, all that water floods away, leaving the bay almost completely empty but for the deep bit in the middle. A lot of this water is funneled out through a huge underwater canyon at the mouth of the bay called the Lune Deep, which in itself is a fascinating place. So back into Morecambe Bay, the massive tides create vast areas of sand and mudflat at low tide. In fact, Morecambe Bay is the biggest intertidal area in all of the UK, and all of this mud and sand is a dream come true for many birds, as it is teeming with life and the birds gobble up the huge amounts of worms, shellfish and sea snails. Because of this food, hundreds of thousands of birds fly here during the autumn and winter to feed on all those little critters in the sand and the mud, before they fly back to their breeding grounds in various places around the world, and this makes Morecambe Bay one of the most important places for birds in all of Europe. So these intertidal mudflats don't just feed birds, they feed fish and they also feed people as well. So Morecambe Bay is a thriving fishing industry with fishermen, many from families with generations of fishermen, harvesting cockles and mussels from the bay. Whereas cockle fishing in other parts of the UK has become quite an industrialised process, in Morecambe Bay they still collect them by hand, using traditional age-old techniques which look pretty backbreaking to me. And these fisheries are carefully managed and work alongside the birds and nature of the bay quite happily. Now, as well as the sand and the mud, the tides and the strong winds of Morecambe Bay also create two other important habitats. These are salt marsh and the towering sand dunes found in the north of Morecambe Bay around Walney Island and the Duddon Estuary. Salt marsh, if you don't know, is the squelchy green fringe you get around the coast in some low-lying tidal areas, where the ground is covered in grass and other plants, but during bigger tides it becomes fully submerged under the sea. So this no man's land between land and sea used to be really common in Britain, and we had huge tidal landscapes stretching miles inland. But over the hundreds of years much of this has been lost, but in Morecambe Bay fortunately we still have lots of it. These two habitats are really important for a whole range of creatures, but one quite cute little one is the natterjack toad. This is a rare toad that lives on the coast and is only found in a few places now, but one of its strongholds are the dunes and salt marshes around Walney and north of Barrow. And during the breeding season, if you go for a walk here at night, you can hear their calls all around you, and it's like being in the tropics. Now there is also a special fish in Morecambe Bay which is worth mentioning, and that's the European smelt, or what some people call the sparling, and it usually lives in the areas where the rivers and sea meet. Now the smelt isn't much to look at, it's not charismatic or flamboyant, it's just a quiet fish that quietly cracks on with its life. But it's important, it's an ancient type of fish, and it used to be really abundant in lots of British estuaries. And there are records of smelt being eaten way back to Roman times in Britain. But it's now either extinct or close to extinction in many of UK estuaries. And in Morecambe Bay there is now a new conservation zone set up to try and recover some of these numbers back. So smelt are quite an interesting fish in that they spend most of their lives around the coast, feeding on the salt marshes. But when it's time to breed, they will ride a big tide as far up the river as they can get, to the point where the water stops being salty, and there they'll spawn, laying their eggs on the stones and weeds on the bottom of the river. They then ride the tide back down the river again to the sea, and they do all of this on just a couple of nights of the year. And strangely, smelt also smell quite strongly of cucumber. So if you're walking along the riverbank one night while the smelt are spawning, you'll actually smell cucumber on the air. And finally, in amongst all that sand out there, we have huge rocky outcrops which are called skiers, and this is a Norse word for hill. And during the winter a lot of these skiers are fairly bare, but in spring they support massive mussel beds which grow super fast in the nutrient-rich water. And they don't last long though, because one of the reasons for that is due to the mussel's nemesis, and that's the starfish. And as soon as the starfish catches the scent of these young mussels, they emerge from the depths, sometimes in biblical swarms that turn the sea orange when you see them from the air. And they just gobble up all the mussel that's there, and by the time winter comes along there's hardly anything left. So there you have it. These were just a few of the reasons why Morecambe Bay is an amazing place for nature and for people. There are so many more intriguing features of the bay, but hopefully this little taster will mean that the next time you're out in the bay, you will feel a little more in touch with the wildlife that's all around you. And thanks for listening.
We're all living in very difficult times. The COVID experience has hit every community, has caused massive changes to the way in which we live. But of course, COVID isn't the only threat we face. Climate change brings on many challenges too, from flooding, changing sea levels, erosion, clean air, the elimination of certain species, and a whole set of quite fundamental threats to the way we live. And the most important thing to know from this is when communities are impacted, it is their resilience and strength, which is the thing which will enable both every individual within them to survive and the whole society to be able to go forward from strength to strength. We need strong communities to be able to support strong individuals in addressing the challenges of change, which are really immense. And that means all parts of the community, young, old, different minority ethnic communities, different groups of people, people in work, people at home. We want communities which ensure that every part of the community can live in strength and vitality. These threats, which test the strength of any community, mean that we have to develop institutions and organisations within the community which can make us work at our most effective. That means our schools, it means nursery and under fives, it means colleges, it means community centres, it means health and social care, doctors, nurses, it means the police and the law enforcement organisations, it means planning and transport institutions taking the right decisions for how we travel, how we work, where we build, what we do. And all these types of institutions of our community need to respond to local needs, need to understand local people, need to understand what people want, and need to involve local people in their core decisions about what they do and how they do them. So we need people who live in a particular community to be part of the governing structure of the schools, of the health centres, of the police, or whatever it may be. We need people from those local communities to be part of those institutions, to be the teachers, to be the police officers, to be the doctors and nurses. We need people from those local communities to be fully engaged in deciding what's the best way of addressing the challenges of the future. That's what I mean by having strong communities, communities which are resilient, which can endure, which are sustainable. And they need to look not just to the needs of the present, but also to the needs of the future. Because the point is, in the world as we are now, our world is changing very, very fast indeed, changing more rapidly than we ever could have imagined. Not only things like climate change, which are extremely important, but issues like the more ageing society, more people living longer, great news, but many challenges that come from it. The meaning for the future of work, of things like artificial intelligence, machines doing jobs that otherwise people would be doing. What's that going to mean for our economies and our prosperity in the communities in which we live? So my fundamental message is put the community first, build strength in the community and its institutions. Ensure that these aren't coming from outside, but are coming from the community itself. And that's true in Morecambe. It's true in every community in the country. It's the aim to which we all ought to be operating. It applies to the school curriculum, to the health service, to the community facilities which are planned, to our transport and overall structures. These are the issues that we face, and I hope and believe the project we're all engaged in will enable us to make a real difference at strengthening the Morecambe communities to deal with these challenges of the present and the future.
Hi, I'm Michael Core. I'm originally from Austria, that's the one without the kangaroos, but this is my 23rd year here now in Morecambe and I love it. I love the place. People sometimes ask me what's better, how does Morecambe compare with Austria? And the answer is, well, it doesn't. Austria has mountains and snow, but is landlocked. And Morecambe has got the sea and the most beautiful bay I know of on the planet. And so I love the place and I love the people in it. The people here in Morecambe are friendly and helpful, generous, open and honest. They wear their heart on their sleeves and they are incredibly resilient, which you kind of need to be if you live in one of the most deprived places in England. Some of the wards here in the West End are in the top 1% most deprived. And that's why 18 years ago we started our two charities, Western Impact and Morecambe Community Church, to help people. Really quite as broad as that, to help people with anything and everything that they might need to get their lives back on track. One of the things we have found over the years to be a real sticking point for quite a lot of people we work with is a lack of hope. The hope that anything can get better, even just a little bit. And maybe that comes from seeing Morecambe take a nosedive from its heyday in the 70s. Maybe it's because Lancaster is perceived to be the better, more intelligent brother across the river. Maybe it's because in the 90s when the Moore Hospital closed, people were housed in Morecambe with little mental health support at all. But I also think it's endemic in marginalised people. There's a question I like to ask: what are you looking forward to? And many of the people we work with simply don't have an answer to that question. And so they're stuck, a bit like one of the boats in Morecambe at low tide, stuck in the sand, only with no hope that the tide's coming again soon. And so we're here to give them a lift, so that the beauty of the bay, which the Eden Project is going to help us celebrate, is reflected in people's lives. Because I believe that real regeneration happens with people. You know, nice houses and shops, restaurants, tourist attractions, parks and so on, they're part of the answer, part of the solution. But rebuilding lives, restoring hope, that's far more delicate and requires a sense of awe and responsibility. Perhaps hope should be classed as an endangered species. And us Morecambeites, charities, council, churches and businesses, together with the Eden Project, can make sure it's still around for our grandkids to cling on to and enjoy, and for visitors to be inspired by. We say beauty surrounds, health abounds, nature astounds, hope resounds.
my name is Charlie Gear, and I am Professor of Media Theory and History at Lancaster University. But I'm here mainly because I wrote a serious book with the flippant title. Title comes from Johnny Rotten customising a Pink Floyd t-shirt with the words "I hate" written in biro. Rotten liked the Floyd's music but hated the ethos of prog rock. I love the northwest of England but hate the ethos of the Lake District. The book is, in part at least, an attempt to write about the environment in a way that avoids what I think of as the polite bourgeois pastoralism, the so-called new nature writing, which does little to really address the current ecological catastrophe. It's also true of much fiction. In The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh suggests that the only fiction that can deal with the climate crisis is that which is not taken seriously as literature, such as science fiction. It is for this reason that I took my examples of how to write about the Lake District and the Northwest not from nature writing, but from science fiction itself, including Jeff Vandermeer's masterful Southern Reach trilogy, in which the southwest of the United States has been taken over by some unknowable presence and produced an entirely alien environment. Here's an image from the Netflix adaptation of the first book, Annihilation. I finish I Hate the Lake District with another great piece of science fiction, Tarkovsky's extraordinary film Stalker, which features a so-called zone which has been the site of an alien invasion. When writing the book, I was haunted, or perhaps beguiled, by a fancy of the northwest of England somehow becoming deserted, a zone. I imagined this coming about through a number of science fiction scenarios, the whole area being made uninhabitable by an accident at Sellafield, an alien invasion, as in Stalker, or even something entirely inexplicable, as in the Southern Reach trilogy. This is, I dare say, uncannily close to the plot of Paul Kearney's forthcoming alternative history stroke horror novel, The Windscale Incident, which imagines an alternative history in which Windscale did blow up in 1957, killing thousands and turning northwest England into what he calls a zone full of strange creatures. The Windscale Incident is by no means the only piece of science fiction set in Cumbria. In Sarah Hall's The Cahulan Army, England is in a state of environmental and economic crisis. Under the repressive regime of the authority, so-called, citizens have been herded into urban centres, and all women of childbearing age fitted with contraceptive devices. A woman known as Sister leaves her oppressive marriage to join an isolated group of women in a remote northern farm in Cumbria, where she intends to become a rebel fighter. In another piece of spectre fiction by Hall, she imagines a rewilding project in the Lake District undertaken by the eccentric Earl of Annandale to reintroduce wolves into the north of England. Perhaps the earliest example of Cumbrian science fiction is John Christopher's The Death of Grass, which I also write about in I Hate the Lake District. Published in 1956, it is now regarded as a classic of dystopian and apocalyptic science fiction. It is set in what was then the near future, at a time when a virus is destroying all forms of grass, including cereal crops, presaging famine on a global scale. By the time the main section of the novel starts, this has already caused social and political turmoil in the Far East. The main protagonist, John Custance, an architect, hears from a friend working for the government that there is a plan to destroy London and other population centres with atomic and nuclear bombs, to reduce the population sufficiently so that the survivors might be fed. Most of the novel is concerned with the journey undertaken by Constance, his family, friends and associates from London to his brother's farm in Westmoreland, or what is now Cumbria. For someone who lives near Kendal, passages such as this one gives a distinct frisson. The moors have been more or less deserted, but when they descended to cross the lower land north of Kendal, they witnessed the signs, by now familiar, of the predatory animal that man had become, houses burning, an occasional cry in the distance that might be either of distress or savage exultance, the sights and sounds of murder, and another of their senses was touched. Here and there their nostrils were pricked by the sour-sweet smell of flesh in corruption. In 1970 the book was filmed under its American title, No Blade of Grass. The director makes particularly good use of the Ribblehead Viaduct, a 400-metre-long arch structure that takes a settled to Carlisle Railway across Batty Moss. The railway line, built between 1869 and 1875, was one of the last of the great engineering projects of the Victorian era to rely upon the labour of navvies before the advent of the mechanical digger. What is perhaps particularly eerie is that the devastation the film projects into the near future has in some ways already happened. The land around the viaduct appears undisturbed, other than by the many walkers who come to this part of the world to enjoy the experience of what they believe to be its unspoilt nature. The construction of this particular stretch of the Settle to Carlisle line necessitated the building of shanty towns for the navvies, 5 in all, right where the viaduct now sits. There were shops, a post office, pubs, a public library, a mission, a hospital, and a dead house. There is no trace of any of this now. Literature itself is a kind of data science, giving us rich information but constrained by its form and content. This is certainly true of any attempt to write about the bay and the lakes. The examples I have talked about in science fiction, ghost stories, and anti-nature writing suggest that we can go beyond those constraints to reimagine and rethink what a place might be. Thank you. And I've had this rather amusing image of a driverless car being trialled at the lakes, which is quite science fiction, I thought.
In years to come, people will think anybody could see that they would have gone to Morecambe. Today, people are just waking up to the idea that we might go to Morecambe. You see, I know about these things. I'm not going to give you a highfalutin speech about the science and all that. It's true, there is the marvellous bay which comes in faster than a man can run. There is watching the weather systems form on the other side of the bay. It's watching the birds come in and leave like the greatest biodiverse airport you've ever seen. There are the buildings which hark back to another era, but each with their own grandeur. But the thing about when you're judging why to go to a place, it's like when you're a youngster, the decision over your girlfriend or boyfriend, there's something to do with it smells right. In my previous career in the music industry, there was a thing about the chords you played on the piano or on the guitar where you could spend months and it just wasn't quite right. You know, it felt stimulating, it reminded you of something else. The thing about Morecambe is ultimately the chords of Morecambe are a hit record. Believe me, they're a hit record. That combination of the natural elements that are made so vivid in one place. A destination that has the Lake District with all its visitors on one side and Blackpool on the other. But more than that, it's the spirit of Morecambe. That's the smell bit. You can feel it's a sleeping giant. It's a place that feels the luck has deserted it a bit. But it's not haunted forever. The reason I'm not being scientific about the amazing things we're going to do in Morecambe, anybody watching this will know what the Eden Project can do. They'll know what Lancaster University can do. They know the commitment of all the partners. But ultimately, we have all seen places where people have poured money in and it's been a loser destination, where there's been loads of enthusiasm all wafted together for meetings, but then as the months go on after the excitement, it peters out into nothing. What's special here is it's great people, a great combination, all at the same time believing in the same thing, and it's the environmental equivalent of a hit record. This is Bohemian Rhapsody for the science world. You watch this space. Thank you for listening.